It is looking increasingly likely over the past few days, with all the news that's coming out, that the Robert Mueller investigatory team might actually want a sit-down, face-to-face interview with the president, with Donald Trump. Mueller apparently brought up the issue of interviewing Trump during a late December meeting with the president's lawyers, John Dowd and Jay Sekulow. Apparently, the special counsel's team could interview Trump very soon on some limited portion of questions, possibly within the next several weeks, according to a person close to the president who was granted anonymity to describe internal conversations, saying this is moving faster than anyone really realizes. And they said that Trump is comfortable participating in an interview,
of course,
and believes it would put to rest questions about whether his campaign coordinated with Russia in the 2016 election.
Of course he'd think that.
Look, he might be comfortable with it.
No, I have no doubt that he's comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But should he be comfortable with it? No. Again, that's that unearned confidence that Trump is so well known for. He doesn't realize how much he gets himself into trouble by the things he tweets, the things that he says out loud. He rambles. I don't know. The fact that he thinks that doesn't surprise me, but I think he's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, look, I tweeted last night, if he has even 2 brain cells in his head, he will never, ever allow himself to answer questions before Mueller or the team. But I mean, look, that would require a certain amount of self-awareness and knowledge about how you are and the likelihood of it working well for you. He's not big on self-awareness.
He openly said during an interview that he fired Comey because of the Russia investigation. He openly admitted that. And he doesn't understand that the things he says consistently get him in trouble. So I really hope they do interview him. It'll be wonderful.
Well, look, we're a bunch of like progressives like us. Obviously, we're not on the president's side. What do some of the conservatives think? What do other people think? Well, let's turn now to Judge Napolitano talking about what Trump's strategy should be.
Whether or not the president ought to submit to an interview to Bob Mueller and FBI agents. And my argument is never, never, never in caps should he do that.
Why?
Because he cannot know what Mueller and his team know about the case. He cannot know what evidence they have. And one lie or one close to a lie about a material matter, and he's facing a potential indictment. I don't know what would happen with the indictment because he's a sitting president. No sitting president has ever been indicted for a crime. But if the feds want to trap you, they are very, very good at doing it. Donald Trump is a very headstrong person who probably believes he is smarter than his interrogators, and he may be, but he doesn't know more about the case than they do. It's a trap, and he ought to stay away from it.
I love that, and he may be.
No, he's not.
Come on, Judge Napolitano, come on.
I know.
But look, I mean, I think there might be some people, maybe if you had Sean Hannity talk about this, he might say, yes, he should go talk because I have faith in my dear leader. But almost everyone else, especially the people around Trump, know that this should not happen. That if there is anyone who can, sit in that sort of environment, basically facing a set of people who are piranha in suits, who are there to shred the flesh from your bones, it would not be Donald Trump. Obviously, his lawyers certainly don't want it, which is why they've come up with a couple of alternative ideas of what Trump should do. Here are some of the options. In addition to the possibility of suggesting the president submit written responses in place of an interview, a second person familiar with the president's legal strategy said another possibility being contemplated was an affidavit signed by the president affirming he was innocent of any wrongdoing and denying any collusion. Well, that should end the discussion there. I mean, if he signs it, come on, what more could you want at that point? And so that's what they're thinking of. They're going to ridiculous lengths to try to get him out of having to sit down.
Well, which they should do. His team, I mean, if you're the president's legal team, that's what you're supposed to do. That's what they did with Bill Clinton when he sat down and was deposed at that point by Kenneth Starr. I guess it was an interview, but I don't know if it was a deposition or I think it was a deposition. I don't know what the difference is, but deposition sounds better.
They're not lawyers.
No, we're not lawyers. But so that's how they should defend him, and these are the things they should be offering. But there's no way that the independent prosecutor, independent counsel should accept that either.
So that's the question that I wanted to ask because I'm not a lawyer and I'm unaware of how it would work if they do try to dodge Trump testifying or talking to any investigators. Is he able to get out of that? Like, is it really?
I've been doing some research.
Great, because
actually.
he's the one under investigation. So, I mean, in any other context, the person under investigation doesn't get to say, like, I'm going to give you a written statement that says that I didn't do any collusion.
Well, he still says that he's not under investigation, but
does it come down to the difference between an independent prosecutor and independent counsel?
I mean, it could well. That goes like when it was set up. I didn't know all of the differences. Now there are differences in terms of the subpoena power and all of that, but we're going to get to that in 1 second. First, why does it matter? I mean, you could have him in, or you could ask your questions and have him do written responses. Well, Chuck Rosenberg, former chief of staff to James Comey, says the prosecutors want to see and hear folks in person. They want to probe and follow up, asking follow-up questions. Body language and tone are important, and they want answers directly from witnesses, not from their lawyers, which of course is what written answers would be. The odds of prosecutors agreeing to written responses are somewhere between infinitesimally small and zero. Not necessarily zero, of course. I don't think anyone necessarily knows exactly what would happen if he says, no, you have to come in here. But there are some prior Supreme Court statements about things like this that might give us an idea. So back in 1974, the Supreme Court said, the president's generalized assertion of privilege must yield to the demonstrated specific need for evidence in a pending criminal trial and the fundamental demands of due process of law in the fair administration of criminal justice. Obviously during another time of sort of impending constitutional crises at that point.
It's so telling though, John and Anna, whenever you talk about Donald Trump and all his troubles, let's go back to Nixon, right? I mean, that's who he's always being compared to.
Not just Nixon, though. We have a little bit on Bill Clinton, though.
Well, all right. Well, and Clinton, which we did before, but I mean, really
exactly.
Nixon when it talks about the prosecutorial powers in the judiciary.
Exactly, yeah. And possibly with similar charges coming up as Nixon. But the Supreme Court, in reference to Bill Clinton, said it's settled law that the president is subject to judicial process in appropriate circumstances, which gets a little bit vague there. We have made clear that in a criminal case, the powerful interest in the fair administration of criminal justice requires that the evidence be given under appropriate circumstances, lest the very integrity of the judicial system be eroded. And I'm sure that they would make the case that appropriate circumstances are not on a pad of paper. They are in person with follow-up questions. And so, I mean, we're going to have to wait to see, because they said just a few weeks potentially, but they also said that would be a limited set of questions. It could be that that's not the only time they talk to him. And as Judge Napolitano talked about, they may have no idea of what they've already found out. It could be questions about Russia. It could be questions about money laundering, as Steve Bannon has predicted.
What I really respect about the Mueller investigation is how there haven't, at least as far as I know, there haven't been leaks. And Mueller himself hasn't accidentally or intentionally said something publicly that he shouldn't be saying.
Just a few small ones about impending indictments, basically.
Right, but that's, I mean, that doesn't really give you much. And
those were leaked by the lawyers of the people that were being indicted too, not necessarily.
Oh, were they really?
Mueller's
yeah, it's not coming
team.
from Mueller directly. But I really respect that about him. Look, I know that politically there are disagreements with me and Mueller, between myself and Mueller. But I like the way that he's carrying out this investigation, because I feel like in any other circumstance, there would be a ton of leaks, there would be a ton of information that shouldn't be getting out there. I want this investigation to be fair, and the only way for that to happen is for leaks to not occur.
Yeah,
so.
It's dripping with integrity so far.
Yeah.
When the audience at Fox News sees Judge Napolitano say, hey, it's a trap, which every Fox person at this point on major shows enough knows that Trump is watching. So he gave his legal advice to Trump directly. He's probably figured in his head. He goes, hey, just so you know, don't do it, it's a trap. I think you're smart enough, you're just not. But so when all that goes down, shouldn't the next response from anyone who's watching clearly go, well, obviously there's something, or else you wouldn't tell your client in this case not to do it, because you're gonna get caught up in something. I remember back in the Bush administration, I was looking for some of these quotes. I was talking to Anna about it before the show. Hey, if you have nothing to hide, what are you running from? When we're talking about our wiretapping, our surveillance program. Hey, if you have nothing to hide, why are you worried about being watched? If you have nothing to hide, if nothing has happened, if you have nothing to lie about, why would we be worried about you going into an interview with Mueller and lying?
Well, that's why he caught himself when he said any lie or anything approaching a lie could be,
And remember, the right wing, those who are supportive of Trump, continuously paint this investigation as a political move by the left,
A witch
right?
hunter.
A witch hunt by the left. And they are now constantly questioning the integrity of Mueller, which is hilarious because in the beginning they loved the fact that Mueller was, appointed to special counsel or as special counsel. It's just really interesting to see how they're trying to do this. So it doesn't surprise me that he's trying to make it seem as though, oh, Mueller's just there to trap you, and try to mislead you into confessing or saying things that'll get you in trouble. It's nonsense.
You just watched the video by the Young Turks, Home of the Revolution. If you'd like to get a lot more than that, get the full show by becoming a member. TYTnetwork.com/join.